Ethan raised his glass of deep red wine, a smug smile spreading across his face, the look of a man who thought he had conquered the world. In front of all our elite friends and colleagues, he looked directly at me, the woman who had stood by him for 4 years, and casually dropped a sentence that shattered the room. There are women men admire for their fire, and then there are women men choose for their stability. Julie is my safe harbor. The table erupted in laughter, applauding his pragmatism. But in that heartbeat, I realized I wasn't his partner. I was a piece of durable furniture in his master plan for success. He labeled me the safe choice because he believed I was too insignificant to ever walk away. But Ethan made a fatal mistake. He forgot that once the harbor decides to move his ship has nothing left but the wreckage of the storm. He thought he owned a submissive pawn, never realizing that I was the one holding the fuse to the very career and reputation he spent a lifetime building. Don't turn away because what you're about to witness is far from a standard breakup. This is a masterclass in professional deconstruction. Every lie, every forged signature, and every calculated betrayal is about to be dragged into the light. You are going to see the total collapse of a narcissist when he discovers that the woman he underestimated is the only one with the power to take everything back. Stay until the end to see the true cost of crossing a woman who is about to redefine the word payback. My name is Julie, and at 37, I have spent over a decade building a reputation as the director of admissions for one of Chicago's most prestigious colleges. My life has been defined by discernment, the ability to see through polished applications to the truth beneath, and a quiet, steady climb to a position where my word can open doors or keep them firmly shut. I am a woman who values order, precision, and the kind of grace that doesn't need to shout to be heard. The evening of our engagement dinner felt like the final perfect piece of a life I had carefully curated. We were at a private table in a restaurant where the lighting was dimmed to a soft amber glow, and the air carried the scent of expensive leather and aged oak. Around us sat the architects of the city's power corporate attorneys in custom-tailored suits, educational trustees, and people who measured their worth in networks and optics. Ethan sat at the head of the table, looking every bit the golden boy of the legal world. At 40, he possessed a charm that functioned like a currency, smooth, persuasive, and seemingly limitless. He had a way of leaning into a conversation that made everyone feel like they were the only person in the room, a trait that had made him a rising star at his firm, and as I had believed until that night, the perfect partner for me. The wine was a vintage Napa Cabernet pouring like silk into crystal glasses that rang with a delicate chime every time a toast was made. I felt a sense of pride as I watched him. We were the quintessential power couple. My professional standing gave him a touch of academic prestige and moral weight, while his high-octane legal career provided the sharp modern edge. We were in the eyes of everyone at that table an impeccable brand alignment. It wasn't until the third course, a perfectly seared wagyu, that the veneer began to crack. One of Ethan's senior partners, a man who had seen 3 marriages crumble under the weight of his own ambition, raised his glass toward Ethan. He laughed, a boisterous sound that cut through the polite murmur of the room. He asked Ethan what we were all thinking. How had the city's most eligible and elusive bachelor finally been convinced to settle down? Ethan didn't hesitate. He didn't look at me with the warmth of a man in love. Instead, he leaned back, swirled his wine with a practiced hand, and addressed the table as if he were delivering a closing argument. He said that there are women men admire for their fire. Women who are a whirlwind of passion and unpredictability. And then there are women, men choose for their stability. He called me his anchor, his safe harbor, the one who kept his feet on the ground while he reached for the stars. The table erupted in appreciative laughter and soft claps. The men nodded, seeing it as a profound compliment to my character, while their wives smiled with a practiced, hollow kind of approval. But as I sat there, my hand frozen on the stem of my glass, the air in the room seemed to thin. To them, I was being praised for my loyalty and my strength. To me, I had just been publicly categorized as a utility. I wasn't the woman he desired. I was the woman he had selected because I was convenient, reliable, and wouldn't cause trouble. I was the reliable foundation upon which he could build his monument to himself. I didn't let my smile slip. Years of navigating high-stakes boardrooms had taught me how to mask a shock. But as the dinner continued, I began to watch Ethan through a different lens, one stripped of the romantic haze I had allowed myself to live in for 4 years. I noticed the way his eyes lingered just a second too long on the young, vibrant waitress. I remembered how often he made subtle jokes about how I was the one who kept him from being too wild, as if my presence were a necessary constraint rather than a shared journey. I looked at the trustees at the table and realized they weren't just our friends. They were my professional contacts that Ethan had systematically charmed over the last few years. He hadn't just fallen in love with me. He had invested in me. The realization was cold and surgical. Our relationship wasn't a partnership of equals. It was a strategic acquisition. He needed my stability to mask his own volatility. He needed my anchor because he was a man who drifted toward whoever offered him the most admiration at any given moment. Every time he had praised my calm demeanor during a crisis, he wasn't admiring my strength, though. He was celebrating the fact that I was easy to manage. He had chosen me because he believed I was a safe bet, a woman who would never challenge his narrative or demand the kind of fire that might burn his carefully constructed image. When we finally returned to our high-rise apartment, the silence felt heavy and suffocating. Ethan went about his nightly routine with a terrifying lack of self-awareness, humming softly as he loosened his silk tie and tossed it onto the armchair. He was happy. He had performed well. He had secured his image for another night. I stood by the window looking out at the Chicago skyline, the lights of the city flickering like distant, cold stars. I realized then that I had spent 4 years believing I was building a home when I was actually just maintaining a showroom. I watched him climb into bed and fall into a deep, peaceful sleep, the sleep of a man who feels entitled to everything he has. That night, as I watched him sleep, I realized something unsettling. I had been chosen, yes, but I wasn't sure I had ever been valued. The unsettling realization that I was merely a strategic choice hung over me like a cold Chicago fog refusing to lift, even as the days bled into weeks. I found myself moving through our life with the heightened senses of a ghost observing the structure of our relationship from the outside. The opportunity to test my new grim perspective arrived a week later at a high-profile charity gala hosted by the university. The ballroom was a sea of shimmering silk and sharp tuxedos, a place where philanthropy often felt like a competitive sport. Ethan was in his element, his laughter projecting a confidence that drew people toward him like moths to a flame. I watched him closely as we were introduced to a group from his firm, including a young consultant named Vanessa. She was in her late 20s, sharp-witted and strikingly intelligent, the kind of woman Ethan would usually describe as having too much fire. The shift in his energy was instantaneous and visceral. He became performative, his chest swelling slightly as he leaned toward her recounting a recent courtroom victory with a boastful flair I had previously mistaken for simple passion. He didn't just talk to Vanessa, he performed for her, his eyes darting to see if she was sufficiently impressed by his brilliance. I stood by his side, the silent anchor he had bragged about feeling the weight of his dismissal as he treated me like a stage prop designed to prove his stability. Vanessa, however, didn't look impressed. She looked profoundly uncomfortable. Later in the evening, while Ethan was occupied at the bar, Vanessa found me near the balcony. The air outside was crisp, carrying the distant hum of Lakeshore Drive. She didn't offer a polite compliment about my dress or the event. Instead, she looked at me with a startlingly direct gaze that felt like a lifeline thrown across a dark room. She spoke in a low, hurried whisper, telling me that she had seen the way Ethan looked at the partners' wives and how he used his connection to me to gain favor with the university trustees. Then she dropped a name that felt like a shard of ice in my heart, Laura Mitchell. She told me that before I came along, there had been Laura, and that if I valued my future, I should look into exactly why their engagement had vanished into thin air just weeks before the wedding. Vanessa wasn't warning me about a common affair or a lapse in fidelity. She was warning me about something far more calculated. She whispered that Ethan didn't cheat in the way most men did. He didn't seek emotional validation or physical thrill. He leveraged people structurally. He moved through influential women the way a climber moves through handholds on a rock face. and once he reached the next ledge, he let go without a second thought. The seeds of doubt Vanessa planted grew into a quiet, obsessive investigation. In the privacy of my office away from Ethan's watchful eyes, I began to dig into the digital ghost of Laura Mitchell. I discovered she had been a senior associate with a massive political network and a family whose name was etched into the cornerstones of half the buildings in the city. On paper, her relationship with Ethan looked identical to ours, a perfect alignment of ambition and grace. But the timeline was chilling. As soon as Ethan had secured a major promotion and locked in the support of Laura's father for his partnership, the relationship had ended abruptly. There were no public scandals, only a quiet withdrawal. I found an old social media post from a mutual friend of theirs, a cryptic comment about how Ethan had left Laura holding the bag on a shared venture. It took 3 days of careful reaching out through my own academic network before I managed to secure a meeting with her. I invited Laura for coffee at a small anonymous cafe in a neighborhood where Ethan would never be caught dead. When Laura walked in, she carried herself with a weary kind of strength that I recognized instantly. We didn't waste time on pleasantries. She confirmed everything Vanessa had hinted at, and more describing Ethan not as a lover, but as a prestige parasite. She sat across from me, her voice steady but her eyes reflecting a deep old pain, as she explained how Ethan had a genius for identifying what a woman could offer his career and then weaving a romance around that utility. In her case, he had persuaded her to co-sign a high-stakes real estate investment, convincing her it was the foundation of their future home. In reality, it was a move to tie his credit to her family's immense wealth. The moment his career was insulated and his reputation solidified, he manufactured a series of arguments to make her look unstable, eventually calling off the wedding and leaving her with a mountain of legal liability that her family had to quietly settle to avoid a public mess. He hadn't just broken her heart. He had used her as a stepping stone and then tried to ruin her reputation so she wouldn't be believed if she ever spoke out. As I listened to Laura, the pieces of my own 4-year history with Ethan began to snap into a terrifying new configuration. I remembered the early days of our courtship, how he had been so fascinated by my seat on the admissions board and my close relationship with the university's largest donors. I had thought he was proud of me, but I now saw that he was simply auditing my assets. He had been choosing me every day, not out of love, but out of a cold, calculated necessity. Every dinner party we hosted, every professional favor I had done for him, and every time I had smoothed over his rough edges with my social capital was a transaction he had recorded in his favor. I wasn't his fiancé. I was the current high-yield asset in his long-term expansion plan, a structural handhold he was using to climb toward a height I could now see he would never reach on his own merit. The man I thought I knew was a fiction, a mask worn by a predator who thrived on the labor and reputations of the women he claimed to adore. For the first time, I wasn't asking whether he loved me. I was asking whether I was merely the next chapter in his manual of manipulation. The chilling realization of Ethan's structural manipulation transformed our shared apartment from a sanctuary into a crime scene, and I began to look at every piece of paper and every digital trail with the clinical eyes of an investigator. The physical evidence of his true nature finally surfaced on a rainy Tuesday afternoon while I was organizing our shared home office, a space filled with the mahogany furniture and leather-bound books that broadcast the success he so desperately craved. Deep inside a filing cabinet, tucked behind a stack of benign insurance documents, I found a heavy cream-colored envelope from a boutique private bank. My breath hitched as I pulled out a bank confirmation for a corporate loan totaling $750,000. It was for a private venture. I had never heard of an entity with a generic name that smelled of shell companies and hidden agendas. My blood ran cold when I flipped to the final page. There, listed as the primary co-guarantor, was my name. Below it sat a perfect reproduction of my signature. It was a digital scan likely lifted from a university contract I had signed months ago, placed with a surgeon's precision on a document that leveraged my entire professional income and my impeccable credit rating to secure Ethan's ambitions. This wasn't just a snide comment at a dinner party or a pattern of emotional coldness anymore. This was a calculated criminal act of identity theft that put my entire livelihood on the line. The betrayal felt like a physical blow, a weight in my chest that made it difficult to draw air. I didn't confront him that night. Instead, I waited for him to leave for his firm the next morning before I took the documents to a private attorney who operated outside of Ethan's vast social circle. We met in a sterile, glass-walled office that overlooked the gray expanse of the city, far away from the polished mahogany of Ethan's world. My attorney, a sharp woman with decades of experience in white-collar misconduct, looked over the papers with a grim expression. She explained the devastating reality of the trap Ethan had set for me. By using my projected income as the director of admissions, he hadn't just stolen my credit. He had bound my legal fate to his. She warned me that because I was now aware of the document, any delay in reporting it could be interpreted as tacit consent, or worse, a conspiracy to commit bank fraud. Ethan had designed this loan with the meticulousness of a master architect, banking on the very good woman persona he had praised at our engagement dinner. He was counting on my desire to avoid a public scandal, my professional need to maintain a pristine reputation, and my supposed loyalty to the man I was about to marry. He believed that even if I found out, I would stay quiet and fix the problem behind the scenes, just to protect the optics of our perfect life. The pressure intensified 2 days later when Ethan's parents Marcus and Eleanor Reynolds invited me to tea at their estate. They were the pillars of the suburban elite, the kind of people who believed that a family's reputation was a sacred trust that outweighed any individual's pain. We sat in a sunroom that smelled of lilies and old money, but the atmosphere was far from serene. Eleanor reached across the table, her hand cold as she squeezed mine, her voice dripping with a practiced grandmotherly concern that felt like velvet-wrapped steel. She spoke of a wife's duty to protect her husband's future, hinting that she was aware Ethan was navigating some complex professional hurdles. She didn't mention the loan directly, but the subtext was deafening. She suggested that any emotional instability or unnecessary questions from my side at this critical juncture would be seen not just as a betrayal of Ethan, but as a vindictive strike against the entire Reynolds legacy. Her husband sat in the corner, nodding in silent agreement, his gaze suggesting that I was merely a temporary custodian of his son's reputation. I realized then that I had been auditioning for a role I never wanted the silent shield for a man whose flaws were as deep as his father's pockets. The entire family system was designed to absorb my identity and use it to buffer Ethan's reckless climb to the top. They saw me as a moral obligation, a person whose primary function was to provide the stability Ethan lacked while absorbing the legal and social risks he generated. I looked at Eleanor's perfectly coiffed hair and her elegant pearl necklace and saw the ghost of the woman I was supposed to become, a woman who traded her truth for a seat at a prestigious table and spent her life whispering away her husband's sins. Ethan hadn't chosen me because he loved the woman I was. He had chosen me because he admired the armor I could provide. He had spent 4 years studying my weaknesses, my sense of duty, and my fear of public failure, and he had woven them into a net that he thought was inescapable. He believed that the social and legal stakes were so high that I would be forced to become his silent partner in crime just to keep my own head above water. As I drove away from their estate, the sheer scale of his arrogance became clear. He sat in our apartment, probably checking his watch and waiting for me to return, completely convinced that I was a predictable variable in his equation. He hadn't just underestimated my intelligence, he had counted on my silence to be his ultimate accomplice. The arrogance Ethan had built into the foundation of our life finally began to crack when the walls of his professional world started closing in. A few days after my meeting with his parents, he came home with a frantic energy I had never seen before. The smooth, polished facade of the corporate attorney, replaced by the desperate sweat of a man who realized his luck was running out. He sat me down in our living room, his hands trembling as he poured himself a drink and confessed the $750,000 loan. He framed it as a visionary move, a sacrifice he had made for our future to secure a wealth that would match my social standing. He claimed an internal audit at his firm was looming a routine check that had suddenly become a threat because of a clerical misunderstanding. With a look of pathetic entitlement, he begged me to tell the investigators that we had discussed the loan in detail months ago, that the signature was a formality I had authorized. He actually looked me in the eye and said, "You've always protected me, Julie. You've always been the one to smooth things over. That's why I chose you." In that moment, the last shred of my hesitation evaporated. He wasn't asking for my help. He was demanding my complicity, as if it were a service I owed him. This was the final confirmation of his narcissism. He didn't love me for who I was. He loved me for my ability to act as his moral shield. The following evening, the Reynolds family orchestrated what they called a reconciliatory dinner. But I knew exactly what it was: a final loyalty check. We gathered in the formal dining room of Ethan's parents' estate, the air heavy with the scent of roasted meat and the unspoken command to fall in line. Marcus and Eleanor sat at the ends of the table like judges presiding over a silent court, their eyes scanning my face for any sign of rebellion. Ethan was playing the part of the contrite son, his gaze constantly drifting to me, expecting the stable anchor to perform her duty. They spoke in circles about family legacy, the importance of presenting a united front to the world, and how a minor professional setback should never be allowed to tarnish the Reynolds name. They were gaslighting me in real time, treating Ethan's criminal act of identity theft as a communal burden that I was obligated to carry. When Eleanor leaned in and whispered that a strong woman knows when to be quiet for the greater good, I felt a strange, icy calm wash over me. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. Instead, I set my silverware down with a soft, deliberate click and looked at each of them in turn. I told them that loyalty requires consent, and I had never consented to be a footnote in Ethan's fraud. The silence that followed was deafening. Their shock wasn't born of guilt, but of the realization that their safe choice had developed a spine they couldn't break. My composure in that room as they sputtered about duty and betrayal was my final transition from a victim of their expectations to the architect of my own life. I left that dinner without another word, driving through the dark Chicago streets with a clarity that was almost surgical. I didn't go back to the apartment we shared. Instead, I went to my office at the college, the one place where my reputation was built on my own merit, not Ethan's optics. I sat at my desk and opened my laptop, the glow of the screen reflecting the cold resolve in my eyes. I had the contact information for the firm's lead investigator, a man Ethan had described as a bulldog he hoped I would never have to meet. I began to type an email that was formal, legally precise, and devastatingly honest. I provided no emotional fluff, no dramatic accusations, and no pleas for sympathy. I simply stated the facts. I had never been made aware of the corporate loan, I had never authorized my signature to be used, and I had never consented to any financial representations made in my name by Ethan Reynolds. I attached the bank confirmation I had found in the office and the contact information for the private attorney I had consulted. I knew that by hitting send, I was effectively pulling the rug out from under Ethan's entire world. I was choosing the truth over the optics he worshipped, and in doing so, I was ensuring that the structure he had built on my back would finally collapse. As I sat there in the quiet of my office, the weight that had been crushing my chest for weeks finally lifted. I thought about the women men choose and the women men admire, and I realized how small those categories were. Ethan had spent years trying to fit me into a box that made him feel powerful, never suspecting that the very stability he prized was the source of the strength I would use to destroy his facade. He had banked everything on the idea that I would be too afraid of the fallout to speak up, that my professional standing was a cage that would keep me silent. He never imagined that I would be willing to burn the showroom down just to breathe clean air again. I watched the sent notification appear on my screen, a digital execution of the life Ethan had tried to trap me in. He would wake up the next morning to an office full of questions he couldn't answer and a family that could no longer protect him with my reputation. He had spent his life leveraging women to reach the top, but he had finally reached for the one woman who knew exactly how to let go. For the first time in our relationship, I chose not to rescue him, and in doing so, I finally rescued myself. The truth has a way of moving with its own momentum once you release it, and my email to the firm's investigators acted as the first domino in a collapse Ethan never saw coming. Within 48 hours, the Bulldog investigator had already connected the dots I provided to the silent ghost of Laura Mitchell. The partners at Ethan's firm, men who valued the firm's reputation above all else, realized that the $750,000 loan wasn't an isolated lapse in judgment or a desperate mistake made for love. It was a deep-seated structural character flaw, a recurring blueprint of fraud. They unearthed the confidential settlement with Laura's family, a document Ethan thought he had buried under layers of legal privilege. Faced with the undeniable pattern of a prestige parasite, the managing partners didn't offer him a chance to explain. They offered him an exit. He was asked to resign quietly, effective immediately cited for ethical inconsistencies. In the high-stakes world of Chicago corporate law, a quiet resignation isn't just a job loss. It is a social death sentence. It is the polite way of telling the world that you are toxic. Ethan, the man who lived for the admiration of his peers, found himself stripped of his title, his office, and the very prestige he had used me to bolster. The confrontation I knew was coming finally happened in the lobby of my office building. Ethan was waiting for me, his suit wrinkled and his hair disheveled, the golden boy facade finally beginning to rot. He looked at me with a mixture of disbelief and pure, unadulterated rage, accusing me of destroying his life and burning down everything we had built. He paced the marble floor, his voice cracking, as he shouted that he had chose me over every other woman because I was supposed to be the one who stayed, the one who was stable enough to weather any storm. He truly believed that his choice of me was a gift for which I should have been eternally grateful, regardless of the cost to my own soul. I stood my ground watching him with a calm that seemed to infuriate him more than any scream could have. When he finally stopped to catch his breath, I delivered my masterstroke. I told him with a voice like sharpened glass that he didn't choose me because I was stable. He chose me because he thought I was weak. I told him he had calculated wrong, mistaking my grace for passivity and my loyalty for a lack of options. I left him standing there, a small, hollow man in the middle of a vast, empty hall, the echoes of his own arrogance, the only thing left of the life he had built on lies. The social death that followed was surgical and absolute. In the weeks that followed, I watched from a distance as the world Ethan had meticulously curated began to evaporate. The invitations to the prestigious charity galas stopped arriving. The friends who had toasted to our engagement suddenly found themselves too busy to return his calls. The corporate networks that had once clamored for his attention moved on to the next rising star, leaving him in a vacuum of his own making. Without my professional standing to ground him, and without a high-powered partner to provide the optics of a stable family man, Ethan had nothing but his own fire and ambition qualities that looked increasingly like desperation when they weren't backed by a structure he could exploit. He had spent years believing he was the architect of his own success, never realizing that he was merely a tenant in the lives of the women he had leveraged. He found himself in a terrifying new reality where the women men admire wouldn't touch a man with a stained reputation, and the women men choose were now far beyond his reach, having learned from my example that his safe harbor was actually a sinking ship. Watching Ethan's descent wasn't about a loud public explosion. It was about the quiet, steady withdrawal of every resource he had stolen from me. He lost the ability to command a room because he no longer had the moral weight of a director of admissions by his side. He lost his access to the university trustees because I was the one who held those keys and I had changed the locks. He was left with the realization that his charm was a hollow currency that no one was willing to accept anymore. Even his parents went quiet, their suburban elite circles closing ranks to protect themselves from the fallout of their son's disgrace. Ethan had built his entire identity on being the man everyone wanted to be, but without a woman to act as his shield and his anchor. He was just another man with a checkered past and an uncertain future. He had banked everything on the idea that I was the replaceable part of the machine, but he was learning the hard way that I was the engine that made it run. He thought losing me was the tragedy. He hadn't yet understood that he had lost the only version of himself that actually worked. The dust of Ethan's collapse eventually settled, leaving behind a silence that felt less like a void and more like a fresh unwritten page. A year has passed since I walked away from the wreckage of our engagement, and the transformation of my life has been both profound and remarkably natural. I am now the vice president of a prestigious liberal arts college, a role that demands the very best of my strategic mind and my commitment to integrity. In this new horizon, I have turned the pain of my past into a cornerstone of my professional mission, establishing a mentorship program specifically designed to educate young women on financial independence, institutional ethics, and the subtle mechanics of power. I speak to them not as a victim who survived, but as a leader who reclaimed her narrative. I am no longer just the stable choice or the quiet anchor in someone else's turbulent sea. I am a powerhouse in my own right. My life is finally unburdened by the heavy artificial weight of Ethan's optics, replaced by an authenticity that radiates through everything I do. I have learned that true stability doesn't come from being someone's foundation. It comes from standing firmly on your own ground, refusing to let your value be defined by the utility you provide to a man's ambition. It was during a panel discussion on ethics in leadership that I met Daniel Harper. At 52, Daniel is a professor of ethics and public policy, a man whose intellectual depth is matched only by his quiet, unassuming confidence. Our connection was the absolute antithesis of everything I had experienced with Ethan. There were no grand performative gestures, no strategic brand alignments, and no feeling of being audited for my social capital. Daniel didn't look at me as an asset to be acquired or a shield to be utilized. He saw me as an equal to be respected. Our early conversations weren't about what we could do for each other's careers, but about the values that governed our lives. One evening, as we sat in a quiet library overlooking the university quad, he said something that healed a part of me I didn't even realize was still wounded. He told me that true partnership is about alignment, not leverage. He explained that a real partner doesn't seek an anchor to hold them down or a trophy to show off. They seek a mind that challenges them and a heart that mirrors their own integrity. For the first time in my life, I am with a man who values my intellect long before he considers my utility, providing a sense of emotional fulfillment that I once thought was a fairy tale. Our relationship isn't a transaction. It is a shared journey between two people who are already whole. The final closure I didn't know I needed came last month at a national higher education networking event. The ballroom was grand, filled with the hum of the country's most influential minds, and I was there as a keynote speaker. As Daniel and I moved through the crowd, I saw a figure standing near the periphery that made my breath hitch for only a second. It was Ethan. He looked haggard, the sharp edges of his tailored suit now hanging loosely on a frame that seemed to have shrunk under the weight of his own disgrace. His eyes were restless, darting around the room, as if he were still looking for a handhold, still searching for a way back into a world that had moved on without him. When our eyes met, I saw a flicker of the old Ethan, a desperate attempt to summon the charm that had once been his greatest weapon. He started to move toward us, likely preparing a speech about misunderstandings, or seeking a way to leverage my new position for his own redemption. But as he approached, Daniel stepped forward. Daniel, a man of genuine influence whom Ethan had spent years unsuccessfully trying to impress, simply greeted him with a nod of polite, chilling indifference. There was no scene. I didn't feel the need to gloat, and I didn't feel the familiar urge to rescue him from the awkwardness of the moment. I looked at Ethan and realized that I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no resentment, and certainly no pity. He had become a ghost in the very world he had tried so hard to conquer, a man who had sacrificed everything real for the sake of an image that had finally shattered. I watched him realize in real time that he no longer had any power over me and that his presence was nothing more than a minor interruption in a life that had grown far too large for him to inhabit. I didn't say a word to him. I simply turned back to Daniel, tucked my arm into his, and walked toward the stage where I was expected. I left Ethan standing there in the shadows of the ballroom, a relic of a past I had outgrown, while I stepped into the light of a future I had built with my own hands. The journey from being a safe harbor to becoming the captain of my own soul has taught me a truth that I now share with every woman I mentor. We are taught from a young age that our value lies in our ability to support, to nurture, and to be the stable ground upon which others build their dreams. We are praised for our stability, as if it were a synonym for silence, and we are chosen for our loyalty, as if it were a debt we are born to pay. but true power lies in the moment you realize that you are not a variable in someone else's equation. I look back at the woman I was on the night of that engagement dinner, the woman who smiled through a public humiliation, and I barely recognize her. She was waiting to be valued, whereas I have learned to value myself. She was waiting to be seen, whereas I have made myself impossible to ignore. The equation of my life is no longer about who chooses me or who admires me from a distance. It is about the choice I make every single morning to live with integrity, to lead with courage, and to never again let my worth be determined by a man who only knows how to use what he cannot become. There are women men admire, there are women men choose, and then there are women who choose themselves and change the entire equation. Thank you so much for following Julie's journey of transformation and justice. If this story moved you or reminded you of your own strength, please consider subscribing to the channel to join our community of empowered viewers. We believe that every woman has a story worth telling and a voice that deserves to be heard, and your support helps us continue sharing these powerful narratives of resilience. We would love to hear your thoughts on Ethan's downfall and Julie's rise to power in the comments below. Do you think Julie's method of quiet, elegant revenge was more effective than a public confrontation? Many of our viewers have shared similar experiences of being underestimated only to prove that their true value was far greater than anyone realized. Your insights not only spark vital conversations, but also inspire others who might be standing at their own moral crossroad right now. Whether you admire Julie's strategic brilliance or relate to her search for a partner who values alignment over leverage, your perspective is a crucial part of this channel. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss a new story. Thank you for watching, for sharing your wisdom, and for being part of a community that chooses truth over optics every single day.